Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Sergeant Major Denver Dill, who is a member of the West Point Band and an instructor of American politics at the United States Military Academy. He also developed the Music and Influence course, which he teaches in the Department of Social Sciences at West Point. He also serves as the co-founder and researcher in the West Point Music Research Center and as the Army Music Analytics team leader. Denver Dill, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, thanks for having me, John. Greetings from West Point on the East Coast. Nice to see you.
All right. I'd also like to just mention at the outset that Denver's opinions are his own and don't represent the opinions of West Point or the Department of Defense. So the conversation that I'd like to have with you today, Denver, will cover how music and the arts should be viewed as a tool of influence. But before we get into these topics, could we start by getting a little bit more background on your distinguished Army career?
Sure, John, it'd be my pleasure. Thanks again for having me. This is my 18th year at West Point. I'm a 42 Sierra Special Bandsman, which is a permanent assignment. So I came here right after from grad school working on my doctorate at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. And I've been here that whole time. It's been a wonderful experience. I'm really grateful for 18 years so far and looking forward to more. But in that time, I sustained lip injuries that I had when I was younger, just, very athletic type things. And while I was recovering, I wanted to contribute. So I started to learn basic business things like Lean Six Sigma, process efficiencies, and had a knack for that type of thing. So I was fortunate enough to be able to teach in our Department of Systems Engineering, and then later teach in our Department of Mathematics. And now here I am teaching in our social department, and I'm surrounded by people I have no business getting to call my peers and loving it every day.
Excellent. Do you think you could take just a moment and I'm not sure how many more times I'm going to have the opportunity to talk with a professional musician, a military musician on this podcast. Do you think you could give just like a quick 101 to our audience about what the musician field, the relationship between music and the military, but also how the musician MOS works for the Army? Do you go to, from recruiting to training to employment within the Army? Just a quick 101 on all that.
I'd be happy to do it. So for the United States Army, there are two MOSs where you are a musician, like a player, an instrumentalist or a vocalist. Those are 42 Romeo and 42 Sierra. The 42 Romeo is a more traditional trek. You audition, you go in as a private or a specialist, and then you go to the Army School of Music down in Virginia. And then from there, you go through leadership development courses and you move throughout the globe wherever the needs of the Army take you. My MOS as a 42 Sierra is a special bandsman. So I was recruited out of college and auditioned for my position, went to basic training, came directly from basic training back to West Point, and after 6 months of good service, promoted to staff sergeant. So we find ourselves in very high visibility situations, oftentimes, especially here at West Point, with heads of state or with the mission to the United Nations down in New York City, or all of the major media in Manhattan as well. And so the quality and caliber of musicians that we need is quite high. And so there's a long history, believe it or not, of the United States Army really focusing and caring about the quality of its musicians. Back in the early 20th century, Juilliard actually had a music department for the United States Army, where they would teach Army bandsmen and improve the quality of Army bandsmen through one of our nation's top conservatories. And so those traditions still hold true today, and I'm surrounded by absolute world-class musicians in the West Point Band. Our officer corps does rotate. They are typically the commanders and conductors, all skilled musicians as well. And so we work together as a team to represent the prestige of, in our case, West Point, to be those ambassadors at that strategic level, to create conversations and to put people at ease. An example would be when a head of state comes and we're able to play their song's national anthem and a local song that would be near and dear to their heart. It's often very disarming, and they frequently come over and let us know, wow, we have not heard our anthem played that way before, or it really meant a lot that you would show us that type of respect. There's just a plethora of examples like that. But happy to talk at all about anything you'd like, John, having to do with music or being a professional military musician.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, that does lead into, more the topic I wanted to get into, and that's music and the arts and influence. Do you think you could copy and paste that into, your music experience and experience with the arts? And how do you think about influence, especially related to your professional credentials?
Sure. I think that what sent me down this path many years ago was my undergraduate's actually in marketing, music marketing, and graduate works were more in performance. And in performance, we're trained to try to get you to feel an emotion. So we're trying to take non-verbal cues for me as a trumpet player, and I want you to have an emotional impact. It could be anger, it could be sadness, it could be any number of emotions. I want to impact you with my playing. Well, when I looked around to see who else in the Department of Defense was charged with that type of skill, I found very boutique. There's combat artists in the Marine Corps, and then there's public affairs, but they're not necessarily charged with making you feel. They're charged with telling, excuse me, telling the truth. Well, that led me to our influence practitioners, which takes me down to the psychological operations schoolhouse there down at Fort Bragg. And prior to becoming friends with that community and to start working with them more, I had enrolled in Joint Special Operations University Influence and Special Operations course. And that's when I really found that I had a knack for taking the arts, taking all of the training that I've received in the arts and applying it to principles of influence so that I could talk with an individual or a group of people or make a product that affects a populace by being sincere and by seeking to get an emotional change that then leads to a physical change.
Yeah, thanks, Denver. So maybe I could ask you to just rewind a little bit. Could you talk a little bit about the historical use of music in military operations? I mean, if I were to armchair quarterback it, I could see how music was used to help organize forces on the battlefield, to help communicate when to initiate a charge or perhaps when to turn a unit. But then I can also imagine that music can be used for intimidation or as a show of force. Do you think you could take that in whatever direction you think is productive?
Sure, John, I'd love to. So the use of music for intimidation, let's just start with that. The Scottish bagpipes served that role specifically. It's such a loud instrument, then combined with dozens of them together, it was a very threatening sound to be heard when you couldn't necessarily see your enemy.
Right,
So
I hadn't thought about that, but bagpipes are also just have like this weird, like otherworldliness to them as well, which can be a bit unnerving especially if it's the first time you've ever heard them. I would imagine.
absolutely. And even in the United States, the music that has been played over, the last couple of centuries for those in service in the Army, Navy, et cetera, has really mattered. There have been songs that have been outlawed, like during the American Civil War, because they were causing young men to desert and go home and to not fight. Much like you see today, see over in Ukraine, you're seeing lots of different propaganda, either from the Ukrainians or from Russia. And you start to listen and you notice that there's oftentimes musical cues in there that are appeal to emotion, whether it's an appeal to strength or maybe an appeal to it's bad out here, it's cold, you're not well fed or supplied, come to us. So it's try to create sympathy. Yeah, music has always been a tool of influence and communication ever since there's been humans. So when the Egyptians, when they got into the King Tut's tomb, they found two trumpets there, and you can hear a British bandsman playing one of the trumpets after they broke one after dropping it. But yeah, it was used to communicate, and it was used when you're communicating, then your ability to be persuasive and clear and intentional then turns into a direct communication with the emotions. And so coming out, if you'd like to talk about it, coming out of World War II, just like when you were talking with Major Holzman about the beginnings of propaganda, well, coming out of World War II, we felt as a country, we needed to come up with our own unique musical identity. And so the government went to our prime institutions. It went to Juilliard, it went to Eastman, and it actually went to West Point at the same time because our teacher of music was so prominent at the time. And they worked to develop a uniquely American identity in the arts. So compositions like Aaron Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man, right? Where it's that grandiose, it starts with the timpani and the trumpets, right? The bugle and the drum. It's a very martial sound. And then the intervals are like open fourths, and that all of a sudden becomes the sound of the American West, right? Over, that's what old Westerns sound like. And so it was a very intentional state-sponsored effort for us to distinguish ourselves from the Germans and the Italians, which was how we were leaning more toward our more formal musical artistic institutions. And when coming out of World War II, we decided, hey, we need to focus on being uniquely American, which then we have seen recreated again and again by other countries. My favorite one to talk about is, of course, South Korea. After they went bankrupt, they were bailed out by the International Monetary Fund, and they quickly paid back the debt, really quickly. It's an impressive people to do this, turning in their gold and things like that. But they invested billions into coming up with their own unique identity in the arts. And I wasn't aware of it when it was happening in the early 2000s. I was aware of it it was probably 2009, 2013, when all the cadets all of a sudden are dancing to Gangnam Style and Psy, right? And now we've gone through an election cycle where we see K-pop bands like BTS actually using their influence on social media to affect attendance at political rallies in the United States. I mean, so music seems like, well, it's nice to have. It seems like soft power until all of a sudden it's right in your face and it's actually very measurable and very powerful.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can think of examples in my own life where music has, created some kind of an emotion, so sometimes unexpected, whether it's in a movie and like some like soaring, crescendo, I guess, or of music, especially kind of like at the climax of a movie. It's just like, if it's done really well, it just resonates. Are there any like tried and true uh, musical techniques or scales or uh, that tend to like accompany various different emotional states? Well, like I mean, so you can chunk music up into really broad categories, like ballet, rock and roll. You've got these big categories, and they sound very different. But you kind of get what I'm asking. It's like if you want an audience to just like burst into tears, these couple of things are really what you're looking for, and you can add your own, your own stamp on top. You get what I'm asking?
I do, yeah. So we don't necessarily have to classify them into genres, but what you're asking, I would say, really depends on our ability to know the listener.
Mm.
right? So the more I know about who I'm trying to impact, the more likely I'm going to get the impact that I want.
Oh, and this goes back to your music marketing
Sure.
stuff, like
Yep.
having like a customer avatar. No, yeah, knowing your customer is a critical part of communicating with your customer, whether it's by image, music, etc. Yeah, cool. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I'll spend a lot of time studying who I'm trying to elicit an emotion from. Uh, Everything you can think of, body gestures, age, background, if they tell me that information, what do they have playing throughout the day that they don't think I notice, right? And so I'm really trying to cue in. And then you put all that together and you sort of just make a soup in your brain where if you are a 55-year-old male from Michigan and you want to sound cool, right now, I know no matter what I give you, I need to have electric guitars in it. Because you're going to remember that Highway to the Danger Zone was an awesome song when you were growing up. And I'm going to
Okay.
have a callback to that.
Yeah.
Right. And so it is truly about your research, just like it is for, Joe and Ash and all these other practitioners. The more you invest in understanding who you're trying to impact, the more likely you are to have the desired impact that you're looking for.
Yeah. They say that, fads come in like 20-year segments or something. It's almost like a generational thing. Like you can look at men's ties and the width of a men's tie, and it's like, oh well, we're getting into the skinny phase again because it's been about 20 years or something like that. And I can almost squint and kind of see that with movies and music as well. Like the Top Gun movie came out in like the mid 1980s, but hey, guess what? It's time for the Top Gun reboot, and that was just in the last year, I guess, or something like that. And it's like they're simultaneously trying to market to my generation, which was that original movie generation, and they've got some music that resonates with my generation. But then I've not seen the new Top Gun, but I'm sure that they've got these things like dialed in just so to try to resonate with the broadest audience possible, and even introduce a new audience to the music from the previous generation.
Absolutely. So I grew up and I watched Top Gun, and my father was excited about Top Gun, and now I'm a father and I have the disposable income, and here's Top Gun again. And I hear it in you got to also think about like copyright and licensing, and when
Sure, yeah.
songs are available that are affordable. And so like this morning I was listening to the Tears for Fears song Everybody Wants to Rule the World,
Mm.
but it was a new rendition done by a group called Scary Pockets, and now it's a funk song.
Is
Same,
that right?
same words and chords, but just a new imagination uh, like version of it. And it was just really cool because I know this, but it's not the same, and it's new, and it's these young 20 something year olds who are just crushing it out in California, just being virtuosos, and it just sounds so fun. So yeah, what's old is new all the time.
And something else I've observed, and again, I'm sure that this is very intentional, is the kids movies. And so I've got a 15-year-old daughter. I've got a 29-year-old daughter, two girls. But anyway, the kids movies that I would see with my girls. So with my older daughter, it would be things like the cartoon Aladdin or The Lion King. With my younger daughter, it would be things like oh shucks. Ah, I can't even think of an example. Yeah, like the car wash or something. There's something with a shark, Finding Nemo, and those kind. Anyway, all of those movies have almost like two storylines. There's like a kid's storyline that only resonates with the 5, 7, 10-year-olds, but then there's kind of like this a little bit of an adult storyline grafted on top of it. And I don't want to say that there are crude jokes. They're not crude jokes, but they're jokes that only adults would get. And it's like they're influencing, trying to communicate to two different audiences, but it's also trying to maximize revenue, I would imagine, because as a parent, if one of my daughters told me, like, I want to go see, something that like is made just for kids, like Barney or something like that. And I'm like, oh man, I don't want to go see Barney. But these other Pixar kids movies and stuff like that, I'm like, all right, I'll go, because they're actually entertaining for the adults as well as the kids. What's your take on all of that kind of marketing?
Great. So literally, that was the other thing I was doing in California last week. We have a pretty strong relationship with different folks at Disney. So we were talking about these type of things, their ability to storytell through multiple generations. They're about to have their 100th anniversary, right? A century of Disney. So some of these princess overcoming obstacle narratives that they've cultivated and put out through a fish or through a car or through a robot going into outer space and coming back to Earth, right?
Right.
It's still a princess overcoming an obstacle,
right.
And then they see it through.
Yeah. So many of these stories have the same core features. It's just, the context is a little different.
Yeah, and the pacing of it, and then how they make these completely immersive environments where even the fonts of signs in the background speak to the overall product. And we were going through the parks out in California talking about music specifically as you transition from Main Street to Galaxy's Edge, right? The sound is actually what makes you make that transition while you're walking. The speakers are designed and changed to eventually now I'm in a whole other planet.
Is that right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's super intentional.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Wow. Well, this gets to a couple of other themes from this podcast, is the use of myth and the hero's journey. So we've had a couple of discussions where I've brought up Joseph Campbell and the power of myth and the hero's journey, and actually the Star Wars, the original Star Wars movie, and maybe the whole series, but George Lucas really intentionally tried to tap into some of that commonality to all people and the hero's journey. And like the famous Star Wars bar scene is like going out to this otherworldly frontier where it's like the hero Luke Skywalker is in a completely different world, completely different setting. He is on a journey, and that kind of frontier setting, like you were just describing, which I hadn't thought about with Disney, really makes a lot of sense. You enter the park, you're John Bicknell, you're Denver Dill with your kids, and hey, gang, here we go. And you're off on an adventure in this parkland, and you encounter all of these unusual things, and it really changes your mindset.
It does, and it's something that I think is really fun in the Disney example, but also practical and useful in my future officers example with these cadets, is that in that exchange, John and Denver both agreed to play along. Now, Disney made it as inviting as possible, right? They made it, the website's easy to use. You can do the Premier Pass where you don't have to wait in line. There's all these other options that you can do. But then you get there and it's such an exceptional experience, like maybe after a couple minutes, there's this live musical act that comes through. So now though you're waiting in line, you're still being entertained, right? Or the sound design is such that, oh, I hear that, oh, Spider-Man's about to put on his show. And I can see that from over here while I'm eating a giant pretzel. And so we work with them and we work with other members of like the intelligence communities to see what's effective, what's not, and then how it's quantified. That's a big passion of mine. In the Disney example, a lot of times it's an economic quantification. In an artistic high-minded Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center type mind, it's not just ticket sales, it's also emotions. Did you connect with that person, that individual, even though you're in a room of thousands? Did you make that one person have a personalized experience through your performance? And so quantifying these things has been a real passion of mine since being in the Army. And that's a lot of that space that I feel like I can bring value to my commanders, to the superintendent, to my department, is to not just say, well, that's neat, but to say, okay, how do you measure it? And then we look to other people who measure these type of effects, right? Because the Army is an effects-based organization. And then it becomes a very fun journey to talk about with people is like, well, who will you listen to? If you'll listen to Disney, I'll brief you Disney style. If you listen to NSA, we'll brief you NSA style. You find other practitioners who are in these spaces, and then you say, okay, what's going to resonate with you, sir or ma'am? And then you just tailor your briefings to them.
Oh,
and
yeah.
and that's knowing your audience. That's what we're trained to do.
Right, right. I think really sophisticated businesses, especially like e-commerce, where e-commerce is an important component of the business. They will try to predict who you are by the way you engage with the website. And I don't know, I'm guessing, but the things you click on, or the geography that you're coming from based upon your IP address, and maybe some other features which are collectible. But then they will present to you a web page and buying experience which is more to your liking, and which of course is going to make it more likely that you engage with or purchase whatever it is that they are selling as well.
Yes. So we have worked with Nielsen Corporation in the past
Mm-hmm.
with those ideas. They like to say that they measure everything that comes to glass. So your phone, your iPad, your computer screen, your television, anything that comes to glass, they want to be able to measure. And so we've talked about the different techniques that they use to do that, whether it's signing up to be a Nielsen family member and you log in with a remote and you say, I'm 16-year-old son, this county, this place, right? All the IP information. Or if it's being a family member and being surveyed and having ocean tests, right, to see your openness and all of those other attributes, or your political leanings. They have a large enough population that it is easily statistically representative of the United States or all other countries. And so a lot of times I frame a lot of these things, in your interview with Major Dawson brought this up. I frame them through the lens of game theory, because it's the competition for people's attention, right?
Totally.
That's what everybody's vying for. And when it comes to music, a lot of times people put it in the background and they don't recognize that it's vying for their attention until they're on their 700th download, or it's 12 million views on YouTube generating revenue, or it's the most listened to song in the history of YouTube and it's #1 and it's called Baby Shark. And it's made by a South Korea to teach young South Koreans how to speak English. But it's definitely perfectly marketed for absentee parents to let their kids just click over and over and over and over again, right? And it's catchy. So yeah, I frame things often using game theory and the competition for people's attention.
Yeah, for sure. There's another episode that I can recommend to our audience. We'll have links to those other episodes that Denver mentioned, but there's one with a lady named Emma Chu. You might appreciate this one as well, Denver. Emma Chu, she is the global director of intelligence for Wunderman Thompson, the advertising firm. But this was about a year ago now, but we had a discussion with her about this same kind of thing, the competition for attention. And yeah, I mean, that is right up there at the top of the stack of what businesses are clamoring for, no doubt.
Yeah, when it comes to then looking at a musical component of it, I like to get into research, and there's just mountains of research about how music affects a developing brain. So young children as they're developing, like just tons and tons of research. And then there's just piles and piles and piles of research about how music affects a diminishing brain, right? So Alzheimer's or some other condition as you age, and how it can bring people back to life or have them experience something that they hadn't thought about for many decades. But between being a child and being old or having difficulty, the world just thinks of music as marketing.
Mm.
right? How do I sell X, Y, and Z? Do you subscribe to Apple Music? Do you have an Amazon Music subscription? Are you paying for YouTube Premium? And I find that consumerism to be interesting, right? That's when you're 30 or 40, it's not, well, how is music helping me optimize my marathon training? That would be seen as mostly anecdotal, right? Oh, well, I make my own playlist. I know what I like. I know what's going to be good. Well, do you? Do you know that you can regulate heartbeats with music?
Mm.
Do you want a slower heart rate? Do you want a faster heart rate? You know, all these fun reasons which led us to making a music research center. And the NCAA knows about this. There's a lot of sporting events that the Academy does that I can't interfere with. So I wanted to optimize the sound for our rifle shooting teams. Not allowed. NCAA has that on lockdown so that you couldn't adversely affect another team by changing what's being played.
Oh, is that right? That's a
It
thing.
is.
That
That's
is
a
a
thing.
thing. Oh, wow. On one hand, I get that. On the other hand, I'm like, I don't know. That seems like it's a fair game. I mean, it's like saying that there's not like a home court advantage. You can't. So you're saying that you can't manipulate the music, but the home crowd, you can't tell them, okay, guys, listen, we need to be fair to the away team, or like at a basketball game when the away team is shooting a foul shot and everybody behind the basket is like doing everything they can to distract the player. It's like that's part of the information environment too, but you can't subdue people. There was a controversy a couple of years ago in baseball, which I kind of rolled my eyes out about, where there was some team that was. I'm sure everybody knows what something that my family and some of my friends say is that I always go on too long. It's like, yeah, we know what you're talking about already. You don't have to explain it, especially as you're fumbling through it like I'm doing right now. But anyway, for those of that don't know it, there was a sports team. I think it was the Houston Astros. And I'm actually from Houston, Texas originally, but there was something going on where somebody out in center field had like a telescopic camera, and they could see the signals that the catcher was making, and they would radio to somebody in the dugout. And every time that there was going to be a fastball or what they thought was going to be the heater or whatever, they would thump a trash can and let the hitter know. It's like, hey, we think that this is going to be a fastball straight down the plate. And that was just a little bit enough of an edge to be able, so that the batter knows, well, it's going to be a fastball instead of a curve or something else. And that was just a little bit, and they like banned it, or they called that cheating. I'm like, I don't know. Why is that cheating? That's just a clever way of using the information environment to your advantage in a competition. Why is, the same thing probably happened back in the 1970s or maybe early 1980s, when it became possible for people to watch the coach and basically lip read the coach, and the coach is like, okay, this time we're going to do whatever play, and they could radio to somebody like, hey, they're going to do this play, be on the lookout. And that's why coaches now like put up a clipboard, right, so that you can't read their lips. It's the same thing. Anyway, you got me off on a tangent there with manipulating the sporting environment with music. I mean, to me, that seems like it would be fair play. But you're like, no.
No, I totally think it's fair play, because of a principle we teach in our class, which is a game theory principle. If you set the rules, you're likely going to win the game. And so if that team hasn't had an explicit rule that says they can't look at that, well, then that's somebody else's problem for that, right? This is being a good practitioner, is figuring
Right.
out the angles that nobody else is looking at, and that becomes the information advantage.
Yeah, it's the same thing with signals intelligence. If you're foolish enough to broadcast in the open in plain English or plain Russian or whatever, without any kind of encryption, then, well, don't be surprised if someone takes that information and uses it against you. It's the same thing.
Well, and you had shared with me some satellite work that you've been consulting on, and looking at entropy, and also looking for sort of outliers in that space, right? Because
Yeah.
I think it's a great application. Like we want to look for variation, anomaly detection, right? We want to see where things are either intentionally or unintentionally different. Once we have identified those, then we decide if we want to replicate them or eradicate them, right? And if we look in places where our enemies aren't, well, we're going to maintain the advantage. So that's we always need to, this is where I think creativity plays a huge role. You know, it's just saying what if, I wonder if, I'm curious about, like, to maintain this intellectual curiosity wherever you go, any space, you know, whether it's an engineering space, whether it's an art space, whether it's just a leadership space, you're just always saying, I wonder if, or I wonder why. And I think that that's a really empowering statement. It doesn't feel like we're never going to, or I don't know how. It's like, well, if it can be learned, I'm going to try to learn it. And you just keep continual improvement over time. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that takes me to you shared with me a couple of things that you wrote, and one of the points that you made, I'd like you to expound on it just a little bit, is talent, and being able to bring in a mix of people who might not be considered traditional military people, but they bring a perspective into the military which can be useful. Do you think you could talk about some of your thought leadership about talent management and the kinds of people that we need in today's military and government to address today's challenges?
Sure, that'd be my pleasure. I actually have a class coming up in a week that is just focused on talent identification and talent management as part of the music and influence course. I think that it's important to have diverse teams. And diversity doesn't necessarily mean in a photograph. It means in attributes. It means in skill sets. It means in approaches, and it means in areas of expertise. And so I've done a couple of different threat casting sessions with our Army Cyber Institute, which is, really enjoyable because I'm working with researchers over in England, I'm working with cybersecurity specialists, and I'm working with social scientists who are experts on Russia or China, all these other topics. And the more diverse we can put people together, the more likely it seems to me that we're going to have someone step up and actually speak truth to power. Instead of just like, what are we seeing overseas? We don't want to have just yes men, right? If everything's always yes, and you're convinced that our team has figured out everything, or our leader is definitely perfect and every decision is going to be good, you're just going to get into a leadership vacuum, and nobody's going to tell you until you've crashed the car. And so I really think that the amount of effort you put in toward identifying talent will repay itself time and time again. And I know that our social department's philosophy is hire difficult, work easy. So they keep track of people for a very, very long time. And to be asked to teach in the department is like a crazy honor, because they want to work easy, but they also want to bring in the highest caliber talent that they can. So alums like General Petraeus, or the head of Homeland Security, or Martin Dempsey, all these people, right? They all flow through one department at West Point. And we never want to betray that environment. And so I feel like one of the ways to do that is to constantly challenge with diverse teams, and with looking at the young, even some of my students now, are they a potential captain or major in the department into the future? Do they represent themselves that way in person, and is their writing of that caliber as well, or their approach and their critical thinking, analytical skills, are they able to apply it to some of these more ambiguous and gray zones that I force them into?
Yeah, so needed these days. What's a good book or other online resource that you could recommend to our audience that maybe touches on some of these themes that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I thought about that because I heard you ask other people. I think that the 26 Words That Created the Internet Here by Jeff Kosseff, I think that this is a pretty good one. It's pretty focused on Section 230 of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which has come up in a number of your podcasts as well. but I see it as a key part of America's information space. And what they were trying to do is sort of the beginnings of regulating morality on the internet. And it's still contested today. But I think it's an important idea of truth pursuit. And a lot of the ways that people get angry at each other in the United States is that they are convinced they know truth and are convinced the other person doesn't. And so now we butt heads. And I like to challenge the cadets in my class to say, well, how do you know that you know truth? Right? And are you going to use the scientific method to say that, well, I did it 10,000 times and the same outcome came, so therefore likely it's true? Or are you using some sole source with heavy bias that then is in an ecosphere of other sources that just reflect the same information, much like we were seeing with Russia and TikTok, paying TikTok influencers to put out the exact same message with no variation. So confirmation bias and looking for things like that. Yep.
Oh, awesome. Well, we will have a link to that book in the show notes. And also, Denver, you shared with me the reading list from your, I think your music analytics class, or maybe it was your music and influence class, one or the other. But would you mind if I drop those books into the show notes as well? There's like 20 or so books that are part of Denver's class. I'll just read off a couple of them. The Social Psychology of Music, Music and Conflict Transformation, Propaganda and Persuasion, Chronicles of a Black Musician, Game Theory and Strategy, 33 Revolutions a Minute, plus about 15 more. So awesome, really interesting stuff. And with that, Sergeant Major Denver Dill, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, John, thank you so much for having me. I hope we can continue this conversation offline. I really enjoyed everything you've shared with me so far, and I'm really enjoying the other podcasts that you've recorded. So thanks for putting those out there. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.